So I thought it'd be pretty interesting to make a video about what life is like as an auditor and the day-to-day experience of an auditor. And this is the job I had for a number of years. I don't necessarily do anymore, but I thought it'd be pretty interesting as far as for anybody to kind of understand out there, whether you're a business owner or maybe you're a taxpayer and you kind of want to understand how that auditing type process works, or maybe even just as an individual being curious if this is a field you may be interested in getting into. And there are certainly a lot of positives and negatives, just like any other job out there. Positives, I got to learn things I necessarily want to have any insight into otherwise. And negatives, there's tons of negatives that I'll get into, as well as an explosive conversation that kind of ultimately led to my decision to leave the auditing field altogether. And in general, I would say for most people, they'd be pretty surprised on how certain types of audits work, especially on the government's behalf. And I kind of imagine it relating it to like the legal system. Everybody kind of envisions the legal system being a perfect system, that it's very black and white, especially if you're not necessarily involved in the legal system or never had gone through it yourself. But once, you talk to people that have gone through it, they will tell you, it's very odd that you get advantages for having more money and basically get penalized for not having money, and that there's a lot of wiggle room and a lot of loopholes and a lot of gray areas. And the same is definitely true for auditing. So I thought it'd be pretty insightful for other people to understand this. And to just briefly give a little bit of background for people who may not necessarily understand auditing, there's different types of auditing out there. You could have private companies out there. Let's just say Target, if it wasn't necessarily a public company, could go out there and basically hire, an accounting company out there and basically have these auditors come in and basically point out their, vulnerabilities and basically point out, hey, this accounting method you're using over here is a little bit questionable. And there's no necessarily any big penalty. You don't get penalized for that. It's just the accounting firm. You benefit from the accounting firm and an outsider basically, evaluating your system. And this is different from, let's say, the IRS coming in, because, the IRS will definitely penalize you if you're doing something wrong. Now, to basically just kind of keep it simple, where I worked was kind of a little bit of a middle ground where we worked for, our own accounting firm, but that accounting firm was contracted by the government to basically conduct audits on their behalf. So we kind of were working on the government's behalf. I had a government ID and everything like that. And there are plenty of different types of fields as well, but just to basically simplify it, I basically worked in the healthcare field. So if you think about, government money like Medicare and Medicaid, if somebody is using that money and goes to a hospital that accepts Medicare money, then, there's only so many things they can kind of charge. I'm simplifying the whole process here, but there's only so many things they can charge to that person using Medicare money. So if a typical patient would come in and have a checkup and that costs usually $100, the hospital cannot just start to tack on random costs just because they want to. Whereas if it was a private customer in a private hospital, then it's not necessarily too much of an issue because, it's everybody's own decision. But with Medicare and Medicaid, people definitely care, which is a good thing because, we want to make sure our taxpayer dollars are going to good use. Now, to kind of get into some of the specific problems as far as why auditing wasn't necessarily right fit for me, and on top of that, what may surprise a lot of people out there is think about what would be a reasonable cost to charge for a checkup, right? So let's say one hospital out there charges $100 for a checkup for somebody that's using government money. Then and included in that $100 is a $10 cost for a gown, which, that seems reasonable enough. But now let's say that there's a different hospital out there that for a certain checkup, they only charge $90. So it's actually cheaper. But the reality is they charge, built into that $90 cost is a $10 cost, because every single time a patient comes in and sits on a chair, they just get rid of that chair, they throw it away and buy a whole new chair altogether. That seems pretty unreasonable, but yet the cost is a little bit cheaper than the other hospitals. So this is where some of the nuances and different things start to kind of get complicated, and also kind of becomes a little bit more gray and not necessarily so clear cut as people may think. And accounting firms, they do their best to make sure that there's ways to basically test what is reasonable and what's not reasonable. And I'll get into that a little bit because that's kind of an interesting idea as well. But at the end of the day, what is reasonable ends up being subjective, right? Even if you have a certain amount of tests to test what is reasonable, you still end up, who built that test, right? And you run into that with accounting firms all the time, where they basically will say things like, well, this is the test, and the test says it's unreasonable. And it's like, yeah, but it seems reasonable to me, and we're the ones who came up with the test, so can't we just change the test? So, and in general, what they usually do as far as testing, there's two main ways in general, and I'm once again oversimplifying a lot here, but one is basically just to compare it to the prior year, right? So if I'm trying to get a general sense as far as, hey, this hospital is spending $10,000 on, bed covers. Does that seem reasonable? Well, last year they spent $9,000. Seems reasonable enough. But yet you can have another hospital out there basically charge $5,000 per year for bed covers, but yet the year before they only charge $1,000. So that kind of seems unreasonable because you went from $1,000 to $5,000. So you basically times 5 the amount of bed covers you have. But yet in general, that $4,000 is actually a lot less significant relative to the $10,000. The other main method as far as testing what is reasonable would probably be basically just having kind of a standard across the board. So if you think about on average, hospitals this size end up spending about 20 grand for bed covers, then that $10,000 seems more reasonable because compared to the average, as far as hospitals that size, it seems pretty reasonable. So now to kind of get into some of the problems that I ended up having as far as working at this, certain company or different accounting companies, and why, auditing wasn't necessarily right for me and it may not necessarily be right for you. And as a business owner or as a taxpayer, why auditing may kind of seem a little bit more questionable than you may think. So in auditing and accounting in general, there's usually this problem as far as how do you relate cost in different expenses back to whatever service or different thing you're charging. So a good example of this would be in a hospital. Let's say you have a $10,000 machine that's meant to basically, do brain scan and basically diagnose someone with a special, very rare disease. And so you only end up having one person a year come into this hospital and actually use that machine. And so it kind of seems in a way reasonable to use that cost. Maybe after 10 years, you end up having 10 people. So you relate $1,000 of that machine cost to each customer for each year. But the problem is the hospital in general kind of benefits in a way, because if I'm a regular person, I have to choose between hospital A that doesn't have any specialized tools versus hospital B where they basically have, a million different specialized tools. Even though I may not necessarily be the customer to use it, I go there because at the off chance that I might. So in a way, the hospital does benefit. All the customers benefit from that hospital having this specialized tool, this $10,000 machine. Or another example that's probably a lot more relatable to people is if you think about a break room. At a hospital, the better the break room is, it's probably going to attract better employees. Better employees ends up being better patient care. So, there's a good, argument to be made that, spending more money on a break room makes sense. So, $500 on a break room seems reasonable enough as far as an additional TV, especially for a large hospital, but is a $5,000 TV really necessary for a hospital to have, especially if it's like ultra HD, multiple 10 million different colors and stuff like that? Is that really reasonable? And is that really reasonable to end up charging back to a patient that may be using government funds? So it's really a hard argument because there's no fine line. There's no really hard cutoff as far as, the cutoff for a reasonable TV is $1,000. And you certainly could make the argument that this is exactly why we have rules and regulations to basically reference on whether or not a $500 TV is reasonable or a $5,000 TV is reasonable. But this is kind of where that balance comes from, right? So if we have too many rules and regulations, then it basically becomes impossible to know all of them, right? So then any hospital out there, if you have enough auditors and enough time, you basically are going to find something that you can penalize them for because it's almost a guarantee that they missed some kind of rule or regulation out there. And on top of that, even small hospitals can't compete with the big hospitals because as a small hospital abiding by the same rules and regulations, you have to hire a whole legal team and a whole bunch of accountants. But certainly on the flip side too, if you don't necessarily have any rules or regulations, then there's more subjectivity, right? So I may find a TV to be reasonable and you may find a TV to not be reasonable. So we have this difference, and then if there's no rule to kind of guide us on what's reasonable or not, then basically it's just whoever can debate their argument more. And so when it comes to auditing, there's pretty much kind of in this middle ground where yes, there are certain rules and regulations. There's quite a few actually, but on top of that, there is kind of this gray area of subjectivity where if I can't make the argument and somebody can make a better argument than me, then we'll just follow their belief as far as how to interpret a certain law or rule, even though I could be more in the right, but it's just I was so bad at arguing my point that we ended up going with the other person. And this is actually kind of what ended up driving a wedge between me and the rest of the company. So as an individual that struggled to understand all the different rules and regulations, as well as somebody who has family members, and distant relatives that end up having small businesses that end up having to deal with government regulations on a fairly consistent basis, I end up sympathizing with that. I understand how difficult it can be. And, if anybody's ever worked out there, with any business, especially private business, and especially small business too, you can understand that sometimes things are really messy. Business isn't necessarily as clean cut and as dry as you would think. Sometimes it could be as simple as, I'm sorry, I can't figure out the answer of what this auditor is asking me, because the person who has the information is out sick, and because we're a small business, we don't necessarily have anybody that has access to that information. There's very much a human element when it comes to business. I think a lot of people out there, when they think of accounting or auditing, they always tend to think about, the numbers don't lie, that the numbers will basically show, follow the money or whatever. And that's things you see in the movies or TV shows all the time, but the reality is accounting and auditing is not necessarily as clear cut as 1 + 1 = 2. There's people behind the numbers, and people make mistakes, sometimes honest, sometimes dishonest. And so it's very subjective and interpretive, and it's very messy. So now I'm going to actually speak about this one particular case that ended up leading to this explosive conversation that basically really illustrated to me how the mindset was very much different, how I had a very much different mindset than a government auditor normally would. So obviously I'm not necessarily going to give any specifics to the exact situation or any personal information, especially because we're dealing with auditing and things like that. So let's just say this whole thing is hypothetical. But basically there is a situation where we had this hospital that basically had this business vehicle, and this vehicle was basically charged 60% personal and 40% business, because it was a vehicle that the person used for themselves, but also used for the business as well. Now, the way this business actually came up with the 60-40 split was basically every time that vehicle was used, somebody had to fill out a timesheet, not a timesheet, but a mileage log, and basically track when the vehicle, mileage started and when did it end and what they used that vehicle for. And so over time, she got a pretty good understanding as far as how many times she would see mileage be used for business and how much it would be used for personal. This was all done on paper, so there wasn't necessarily any Excel file or anything like that that could be referenced, but she had a pretty good understanding because she saw this every single day. So what ended up happening, though, is we started to inquire about this vehicle a little bit more. And, in accounting, you typically have like somebody who's like a coworker / mentor / peer, or like you have a senior on your team is usually what's referred to in a lot of certain CPA firms out there. So what ended up happening is, we ended up inquiring a little bit more about this vehicle and wanting proof as far as how they actually calculated that 60-40 split. Like I said, this person didn't necessarily have any Excel file that could be referenced. And this is where the dynamic really started to shift, because the person basically said, the business owner ended up saying, well, I do have the mileage logs, like I keep all the paper logs, but it's thousands and thousands of papers per month just for this one vehicle. So if you want me to mail it over to you, like I'll be more than happy to, or else can scan it over for you. But for me to calculate it myself, I'm going to end up having to hire somebody, at least a temp job, and basically pay them a couple $1,000s for a couple months of work, just to prove out to you guys that it is reasonable for me to charge this car for 40% of the 40% of the car towards business expense. Basically, we were not necessarily willing to do that work, because if she was going to send us a whole bunch of papers and we were going to have to do this work ourselves, then basically it's like we're basically using our time and money and resources to something that's basically on their behalf. So I understand that dilemma, but it was kind of this weird dilemma, because she basically explained, I guarantee you I'm being conservative, because in general, I'd probably say that the business expense is more like 50, if not 60% of that vehicle use. But I went with 40 just to play it safe, just to be conservative. But if I'm going to hire a temp, then, and they're going to, I'm going to pay them and they're going to calculate this, I'm going to charge you guys for the full, business expense of this vehicle. So it was this weird situation, because in the end, the government would end up kind of having a negative effect, right? Because she would end up charging more as far as, it's very nuanced here, but basically the government would have to pay her more for this business vehicle. on the flip side, she would also lose out because she would have to pay an accountant to basically come in and scan and do all this work for her. And from her perspective too, the really, tight situation, up against the wall type situation, was that if she didn't hire the accountant to basically prove out the 60-40 split of that vehicle, then basically we weren't going to pay her for any part of the vehicle. So the 40% that she was charging us for the vehicle, we were actually going to have her owe us back that money. So either way, she was losing out on money. And it was just this very bizarre situation. And to be honest, this whole situation, especially in government auditing, is not necessarily too uncommon. There are situations that I've seen and heard of where it's basically, let's just say a government agency out there figures out that somebody owes more in taxes, and this couple ends up saying, we think we did everything right, but you're saying the government agency is saying that we owe $100,000 in back taxes. What are we going to do? So that couple ends up hiring an accountant and a lawyer to basically combat this government agency, only to find out that, the government agency made a typo, and you know what, you were right, and you did everything you were supposed to do. But that couple is still out that money as far as paying that lawyer and that professional accountant. And so it's kind of this weird situation, because it's like, well, it wasn't even their mistake, but they lost out. They paid thousands of dollars because of somebody else's mistake. So basically, just to kind of wrap up that whole entire story, what ended up happening is I ended up having to go over this coworker's head and basically plead my case to basically a managing partner. And essentially what happened from there was that managing partner kind of saw my way and decided, you know what, we'll just end up asking to basically have, a few hard copy samples so we can kind of see that they're not necessarily just making this up altogether, and that the reality is they do have stacks of documents that would take, a couple of months worth of work to kind of filter through. So in the end, we did obtain those documents and concluded that it was reasonable and that what they were saying was probably truthful. So we concluded that we weren't necessarily going to pursue that any further. But eventually I had this conversation with this coworker, and we were kind of just talking about how healthcare providers ended up having to go through all these different rules and stuff, and how it was kind of very difficult from a small healthcare provider's perspective to, understand all the different rules and regulations. And he was kind of making the argument that, it shouldn't be too difficult. Why did they get into this business at all? And the reality is, some people have noble goals in mind, and they try to get involved in the healthcare provider business to basically, provide to other people, provide a valuable service. And so I was kind of making that argument, kind of saying, sometimes things just kind of scale up. Sometimes people end up thinking that they're going to just start off as a small healthcare provider, but the ball just kind of starts rolling, and it's kind of like a snowball down the hill where it just kind of builds up to this point where it's kind of uncontrollable, and they're, having to learn a lot more than they thought they were going to have to. So this is where things kind of got a little bit complicated and kind of got a little bit heated, and like I said, ended up kind of resulting in me deciding, this probably isn't a right fit for me. Basically, where he was coming from was, all the documentation we would ever need, everybody should be doing it in software. They should be paying for that software. Everything from, a private business perspective should be fairly easy to do. If we ask for documentation, it should be as simple as, clicking an export button or clicking the print button. And I basically made this argument saying that, it really isn't that easy. And if it was that easy, maybe you should be working in the private sector. And that didn't necessarily sit too well with this person. They basically kind of took it as not necessarily the best way. But bottom line is, I was trying to make the argument that if it was really that simple, then everybody would be doing it, right? Like that's kind of how I view things in general, is if it was really that simple, then every business wouldn't necessarily have a problem as far as providing this documentation. And this is what really bothered me the most, is that this person had worked as an auditor their whole entire career so far. They had been doing it for about like 7 to 10 years, and they had never worked in the private sector. They had never worked with a healthcare provider. They never worked on that other side. So I thought it kind of gave this skewed view, right? Because in the end, they've only seen things from their perspective. So as far as they're concerned, as far as a business operations go, they basically just kind of have the textbook school definition, right? And in school and college and university and stuff like that, you basically learn things in an ideal setting, right? A business can basically run a report just by the click of a button. But the reality is when things, a real business, it gets messy. So, things get more complicated to basically figure out how different, expenses relate to one another. Sometimes it can be, 5, 6, 10 different Excel sheets, versus in their mind, they view it as, well, it should be a lot more simple than that because that's what I learned when I was in school. But the reality is it's not that case. So at the end of the day, basically what it came down to is a recognition of that the firm as a whole and basically the whole entire industry as a whole basically had a one-sided view. And if you know me at all, you know that I basically like to try to see both sides of different things. I don't necessarily like one-sided opinions or one-sided arguments. So at the very least, even if I wanted to continue to be an auditor, I felt that it was necessary for me to work on the private side to make sure that I kind of got this full picture. In the end, I didn't necessarily end up working as an auditor. At least I don't intend to work as an auditor anymore because in the end, it wasn't necessary for me. But there are a lot of perks that I want to talk about as far as the day-to-day life as far as working as an auditor. So as far as some of the perks that, I think attract a lot of people is, the stability of income, right? You're going to have a stable job. And as far as auditing and just that kind of industry as a whole, it's always going to be necessary. It's kind of like the same thing as HR. That's always going to be something that's necessary as far as any business operation out there versus, certain types of, specialty engineering, right? So if you get into a very specific type of engineering, that will only apply to a certain industry. And if you want to go work in a completely different industry, it won't translate as well. Versus accounting principles and auditing, it basically translates very easily from one sector to another. And I think one thing that attracts a lot of people is the idea of being able to travel. And that certainly is the case in the auditing world. And that wasn't necessarily the case in my situation, but that was just the nature of the job that I was doing. But, I had a close colleague that basically did get to travel all across the world for free because essentially the auditing firm was willing to pay for somebody. Let's say we were based out of New York City, just to keep it simple. And we were going to audit a company out in London. And it was going to be 5 days, right? So they had to be there Monday through Friday. And the person didn't necessarily have to go back to work until that following Monday. So from the company's perspective, they don't really care when your return date is as far as, how much they have to pay for that flight. So what the person would end up doing is basically get everything paid for from Monday through Friday. But then from, Saturday and Sunday, they would pay for their own hotel, but they didn't necessarily have to pay for the flight back because the flight was going to be paid for by the company either way. So it was kind of a great way for this person to travel because all you're really paying for is just the additional hotel days and obviously the food too, but you can kind of make the argument that you'd be paying for food anyways, right? You got to eat one way or another. So, this person ended up traveling quite a few places for free, which is pretty cool in a lot of situations. But obviously the con to all this is after enough traveling, you basically, don't end up establishing a good group of friends too easily because what ends up happening is, every other weekend you're traveling somewhere else. So it's very difficult to basically get a good group of friends wherever you're actually located. So like I said, if we were located in New York City, it's very difficult to establish a good group of friends there because half of the time you're not necessarily in New York City at all. And another potential perk too is that you end up meeting a lot of different people and basically end up having good connections as far as, different companies you can go work for. Because if you're fairly easy to get along with as far as the auditing process, sometimes what will happen is, somebody representing the other company that you're auditing will end up basically wanting to exchange contact information with you on a personal basis. So that way, if you choose to ever leave the auditing side and end up entering the private sector, that you're basically a great resource for them, right? Because you understand the ins and outs of how the audit is conducted. So if they can hire you, that's a really great plus on their side. The other potential perk too is that you end up having lots of opportunity to basically learn on your own as far as, if you want to pursue a CPA or, any kind of certification like that, or even if you're just wanting to learn more, it's definitely a good opportunity because if you think about any operations that have high and low seasons. So if you think about accounting and auditing, there's usually most places have high seasons and low seasons or peak seasons. And so if you need 10 people to basically get through peak season, you can't necessarily, and your normal operation only requires 5 people. You're not necessarily going to hire 5 people every single time, train them, and then fire them. So what ends up happening is during the low season, you end up having 10 people, even though you only need 5, but you keep those people in place so that way during peak season, you don't necessarily have to train new people. Obviously, there's a little bit of variation. Things kind of get out, skewed a little bit. Sometimes you'll end up having 8 people when you need 10 people to get through peak season. But the bottom line is that usually there's kind of this low where you have too many people and you have this excess labor. And so what ends up happening is they usually encourage you to basically learn on the job. If you want to study for a CPA exam on the job, that's, sometimes encouraged. This isn't necessarily every single place out there, but this can be pretty common as far as different accounting firms. And the last bit of this I want to kind of talk about, in case if you stuck around this long, there's a good chance that you're interested in accounting and auditing and those different types of things, and you want to understand if it's a good fit for you. As far as actual day-to-day, what that's like, what I would say here is that in general, there's basically, you're going to find yourself either Googling a lot of different rules and regulations, or Googling a different, whole bunch of different Excel formulas, or, various things, or whether you're using a software too, if you're using like SAP or something like that, you're going to find yourself Googling, how do you do this certain function or whatever. And, that's pretty common because there's just too many things to know on the job, especially when it comes to the different rules and regulations. There's just too much to know for any individual person. So that ends up kind of being a little bit funny, at least to me, because it's like you basically just have to train somebody to learn how to search things. You don't necessarily have to know anything. And typically also there's a lot of tying out and basically tracing different things. So if you think about, if you've made it this long, there's a good chance you understand accounting a little bit. So basically what will end up happening is you have like an income statement that basically has some kind of financial information, and you will basically trace that through to the GL or some other form of documentation that you kind of can rely on. And the reality is at least me personally, I kind of find that pretty boring, because in the end, you're basically establishing, oh, look at the balance sheet. This is what it says as far as cash. Let's look at what the GL says. It says the same amount. Great. So what? But a lot of people do like it, and I sometimes did enjoy it too, because sometimes when it gets really messy and complicated, it's basically like a 1,000-piece puzzle, right? So, not necessarily everything works out so perfectly as far as here's this cash account, right? Sometimes you have multiple different companies or entities that all flow up into this one cash account, and so you kind of end up having to trace it all together, and sometimes it's a bit of a puzzle. But at the same time, sometimes what I don't like that is because then it requires you to basically push through and get everything right at once. Because if you kind of think about it like building a stack of cards, for example, or house of cards, you start building up higher and higher, and it basically is to your disadvantage to walk away halfway through, because there's a chance when you come back to it, it all fell down. So you just kind of want to build it all the way up to the top and be done with it. And that's kind of the same thing that's true as far as auditing, is that you end up working and you end up kind of reaching this point where you're like, well, I want to leave and get back home, but at the same time, if I leave now, it's just going to cause more work when I come back tomorrow. And I don't necessarily want this video to go any further, because I know it's probably been pretty long, but if you do have any questions as far as what the day-to-day life is and you want more information on that, or what enabled me to get the job in the first place, what kind of requirements, what kind of different career paths can you take, I'm more than happy to answer those types of questions. I'd be eager to, so that way I don't feel like this whole experience basically went to waste. Not that I really think that it did go to waste. But anyway, so if you're curious about that, or if you're curious about, where I'm at now, I'd be more than happy to make a video about that as well. And if you like personal finance, business, economics, or anything like that, or even behavioral finance, which is something I very much enjoy talking about, please consider subscribing, and I hope to see you in the next one.